In the autumn of 2009, at a farm sale outside Harlan County, Kentucky, an auctioneer named Dale Fitch stood beside a floor loom that nobody wanted. It was a large thing, old enough that the wood had gone the color of river mud, with a broken treadle cord dangling loose and a warped beater frame that creaked when the wind came through the barn door. The upper frame listed a few degrees to the left. The heddles, which are the wire loops that the warp threads pass through and that translate the treadle motion into the shed opening, were bunched and tangled in one corner like abandoned netting. A sheet of old newspaper had been draped across the beater at some point in the past decade and had dried and split and now curled against the frame in two yellowed pieces. Dale had already called it twice without a bid. He looked out at the crowd of buyers in their barn coats and said what everyone in that field already believed. He said it was a nice piece of history if you had the wall space for it. A man named Court Blevins raised his card at $250. He was 53 years old at the time, a furniture restorer from the hill towns above Hazard, Kentucky, and everyone who knew him knew two things. He was the quietest man at any sale, and he could read old wood the way a good doctor reads a face. He was known for his patience and his hands. He had been known for both since Roy, his father, put a hand plane in his grip at age 9 and told him to feel when the wood was ready, not look. Nobody bid against him. 14 years later, a textile studio in Asheville, North Carolina, sent an appraiser named Lois Strand to Court's barn. She spent 2 hours with that loom, and when she came back to the house, she offered him $17,000 for it. She said she needed to think about it before she went higher. He said he would keep it. She doubled the offer the following week without seeing the cloth he had woven on it. $34,000. For a loom Dale Fitch had called a piece of history. This is the story of the 14 years between those two numbers, and of what Court Blevins understood about that loom that Dale and nearly everyone else in Harlan County did not. It is also the story of a set of notebooks, a tension system that had not been in common practice in living memory, and a part-time furniture restorer who spent most of 2 winters learning to weave on a machine that a professional auctioneer had called an anchor. If you have ever suspected that the people who set prices and the people who understand value are not always the same people, this story is about why that is and what the difference looks like in dollars. Let me take you back to where it started, because nothing about this makes sense until you understand what he was looking at. The sale was on a Tuesday in October, the kind of morning when the light comes through the ridgeline flat and gold, and the grass in the bottom still has frost on it, past 9 o'clock. The estate was the late Marvella Combs, who had died at 91 and left behind a farmhouse stuffed with 4 generations of tools and furniture, the sort of place that drew furniture dealers and antique pickers from 3 counties. They came for the walnut pieces mostly. They came for the hand-carved bedsteads and the corner cupboards. 2 dealers had driven down from Lexington specifically for a walnut secretary desk that Marvella's family had decided to sell with the rest. There were 60 or 70 people in the yard by 9 o'clock, more at the barn door, and Dale had arranged the sale in a loop so that the bidding moved through the outbuildings first and ended at the house. The loom was in the main barn. It was not near anything desirable. Court had driven up from Hazard in his pickup, a 2001 Dodge with a cracked side mirror and a coat of faded green paint that most people assumed meant he couldn't afford a newer one. He walked the barn before the bidding started, the way he always did, touching nothing, just looking. His daughter Ray had come along, 24 years old and 2 years out of a design program at Morehead State, and she was the one who spotted the loom first. She called it gorgeous, and he said nothing. He stood in front of it for 4 or 5 minutes with his hands in his pockets, and she got a little embarrassed for him, standing there like that while the buyers moved around them. A picker from Pike County walked past, glanced at the loom, and didn't slow down. 2 women from a Lexington antique cooperative looked at it from across the barn and moved on to a pie safe against the far wall. He had told her almost nothing about what he saw that morning, and she didn't understand why he bid on it at all. It looked broken. The back castle listed to one side. One of the beams along the upper frame had a visible crack, sealed with what appeared to be old hide glue. The reed was missing 8 or 9 teeth in the middle, which meant it couldn't weave anything, even if you got it running. The remaining heddles were a tangle that would take the better part of a day to sort, and it was enormous, 150 years old, at least if it was a day, and they were going to have to get it out of the barn in pieces and load it into the truck in 3 separate trips. Dale Fitch looked at Court's card when it went up, and he took $250 because there was nothing else to do. He called it twice more in the 30 seconds after for form's sake, and nobody moved. He looked at Court with the expression of a man who has conducted a lot of auctions and knows when something has gone to the wrong person for entirely personal reasons. He came over afterward and said, "Seriously now, what are you going to do with it?" Court said he hadn't decided. Dale said, "Son, that's a lot of barn space for an anchor." He meant it helpfully. He was not a dismissive man by nature, just a man whose profession required him to know the price of things, and who had called this one correctly by every measure available to him. Court said he appreciated the thought and started pulling apart the loom's upper frame. Let me tell you what he was actually looking at in that barn, because the crack in the beam and the missing reed teeth and the broken treadle cord were almost irrelevant to the question he was asking himself. Court Blevins had been restoring furniture since he was 19 years old, when his father Roy started teaching him in the shop behind their house above Hazard. Roy had been a finish carpenter most of his life, a man who built cabinets and staircases and ran trim on new construction through the 1970s and 1980s, and who had, alongside that practical work, spent a significant portion of his spare hours studying wood, in the way that a certain kind of mountain man studies things he finds genuinely interesting. He knew grain and moisture and movement. He knew what a piece of timber was doing when it shifted in a frame, and he knew what it was doing when it held. Roy's own father had grown up in the woven goods trade in eastern Kentucky, when the craft cooperatives still ran through these mountains in the years before the Depression and the war changed the economy of the hill towns permanently. He had not been a weaver, but he had worked around the old floor looms that the mountain families built and maintained, and he had left Roy a set of hand-drawn notebooks describing, in close and careful terms, how the old mountain looms were built and out of what timber and why. Not factory looms, not the production machines that came in from New England in the 20th century and that you can still find in craft cooperatives today. The old floor looms that the mountain families built themselves from local timber, sometimes cherry, sometimes white ash, occasionally black walnut, and occasionally, in the most careful hands, from a dense-grained Appalachian red maple that Court's grandfather had called by its local name, which translated loosely as the tight one. The tight one was not particularly beautiful from the outside. It didn't have the honey gold warmth of cherry or the sculptural grain of walnut. It was pale and close-grained and slightly red-toned, and it aged over decades in a barn to the color of river mud. The loom in Marvella Combs's barn was built from that wood. Roy had explained it to Court, And Roy's father had explained it to Roy, and the notebooks explained the mechanism in careful terms. Red maple at high elevation, growing slowly through short seasons with cold winters, developed an unusually tight grain, meaning that the cells in the wood were closely packed and the annual growth rings narrow. A piece of timber cut from a tree like that had a dimensional stability that almost no other domestic hardwood could match. It moved very little with humidity changes. It moved even less with age, as though the wood had already done all the moving it intended to do during the slow decades of its growing and had nothing left to give the weather. A loom built from it in 1860 would be structurally sound in 1960 and, if kept dry and out of direct sun, sound in 2009. The joinery on a properly built mountain loom was mortise and tenon, pinned with hardwood pegs rather than glue, which meant that every joint was designed to be disassembled and reset without damaging the wood. A loom that looked broken was not broken. A loom that looked loose was adjustable. A loom that had been sitting in a barn for 30 years was not ruined. It was waiting. The crack in the beam that everyone saw was in a secondary member, not a load-bearing one. The hide glue had held it for probably 60 years. If you replaced the hide glue with a fresh mix, you were done. Court knew all of this from a set of water-stained notebooks his grandfather had left to his father, and his father had left to him. The notebooks were stored in a tin box on a shelf in the shop. Roy had kept them there until he died in 2004, in March of that year, of a heart event that came without warning on a Wednesday morning while he was planing a board. Court had moved the tin box to the same shelf in the same position in his own shop and left them exactly there. He had read them through twice in the 5 years since Roy died. Not because he had a loom, but because the notebooks were Roy's, in the way that certain things are a father's, and you do not part with them. He spent the better part of 3 weeks taking the loom apart, cataloging every joint, and reassembling it in the back room of the shop he kept in a converted smokehouse behind his house. He did this methodically, drawing each joint before he disassembled it, noting the direction of the pin and the fit of the mortise, replacing nothing that did not need to be replaced. The beater frame, which was the part that everyone looking at the loom had assumed was warped, was not warped. It had shifted in the rear uprights because the hemp tensioning cords along the back beam had rotted through, and the weight of the beater was no longer distributed correctly. When Court reset the rear uprights and relashed the back beam with new cord of the weight the notebook specified, the beater frame came square without any further work. The treadle cord he replaced entirely, a 20-minute job. The heddles he spent 2 evenings sorting and restringing. The missing reed teeth he cut himself from brass stock, a slow and precise job that required a fine file and good light and which he spread over 4 evenings while listening to the radio. The loom did not require much. It required patience and the right information, which are more or less the same thing. By January of 2010, the loom was running. Court did not know how to weave. He had grown up around the idea of weaving, the way you grow up around a lot of ideas in a hill country family, knowing that the thing existed and that it had mattered to people not too many generations back, without ever having sat at a loom or held a shuttle. Roy had known the theory, as laid out in the notebooks, but Roy had not woven either. The notebooks were descriptive, not instructive. They described the construction and the mechanism and the tension method. They did not describe what it felt like to throw a shuttle, or how to dress a warp, or what to do when a weft thread pulled too tight on one side. If you are thinking that this is the point where the story stalls, you would be where Ray was at the time. She had come down to the shop twice to check on the project, and both times she found her father working at the loom, not weaving anything, just running the treadles and watching the shed open, which is the term for the gap that opens in the warp threads when you press a treadle, and through which the shuttle passes to lay the weft. He was watching the shed the way he had stood watching the loom at the auction, in silence, hands at his sides, looking at how the mechanism moved. She asked him what he was doing, and he said he was learning how it thought. She went back to Moorhead State that semester, thinking her father had bought a very expensive problem. Ray's reaction was not unusual, and in fact, it was the same reaction that Court's neighbor and sometime business partner, a man named Gerald Hatfield, had when he came by the shop in February of 2010. Gerald ran a furniture dealership out of Hazard and had been buying pieces from Court for going on 15 years. He was 58, a well-organized man who kept a spreadsheet of acquisition costs and margin targets, and who had a considered, practical view of the regional handcraft market that was based on actual sales figures rather than sentiment. He drove a clean, late-model pickup and wore good boots and was the kind of man who attended the right industry meetings and came home with useful information. He was not, by nature or by training, wrong about anything he measured. The problem was that what he was measuring in Court's smokehouse was not quite the same thing Court was working on. Gerald had looked at Court's shop overhead and the loom and worked out in about 40 seconds that the investment was unrecoverable at any reasonable market price for hand-woven goods. He was not wrong by his numbers. He was performing a competent analysis of a real data set. He was simply analyzing the wrong market. He knew the regional craft market well. He had watched it his whole career, and the picture it painted was consistent. Hand-woven fabric sold at craft fairs for what the traffic would bear, and the traffic, in his experience, would bear somewhere between $10 and $15 a yard in a good year, and less in a lean one. A floor loom that size could produce maybe 8 yards in a day, once you had a weaver, though you also had to account for the warping time, and warping a wide loom could take several hours, depending on the pattern. Gerald had done the labor math, and the math said that Court would need to sell the cloth for prices the regional craft fair market would not support, or find some other use for the machine. He told Court this in the shop one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with his coffee, and he was fair and specific about it. He was not dismissive. He was, if anything, trying to save Court from a sunk cost that he could see accumulating in the man's time and attention. He said, "Court, I've seen people fall in love with old equipment before, and this is a beautiful machine, but beautiful machines don't always have a market." He said it the way a man says something he has thought carefully about and believes he owes you. Court said that he wasn't planning to sell cloth at craft fairs. Gerald asked what he was planning. Court said he hadn't fully decided yet. There are people who haven't fully decided yet because they have no idea what they are doing, and there are people who haven't fully decided yet because they are waiting to understand the thing in front of them before they commit to a plan. Court was the second kind. Gerald, who was wired for the first kind, drove back to Hazard that afternoon, having told Court, gently but clearly, that the loom was a nice piece of history, and that Court would probably do better to sell it for parts. He said this with genuine concern and specific reasoning. He was, by the system he trusted, entirely correct. Gerald was also, in those same years of 2010 and 2011, watching the regional furniture restoration market he knew so well. And that market was under a pressure of its own that had nothing to do with Court's loom. The big box furniture retailers had expanded their mid-range product lines in ways that made restoration work less economically attractive to a certain class of buyer. Gerald had responded by shifting toward the higher end of his market, toward antique dealers and estate buyers who wanted documented pieces rather than working ones. He was good at this. He was always good at whatever he turned his attention to. He was simply looking at one set of numbers at a time, which is not a flaw so much as a limitation that a spreadsheet builds into you if you trust it too long. If you have ever watched someone quietly absorb an opinion they disagree with and then go back to work, you know what Court looked like for the rest of that winter. He spent most of 2010 learning to weave. He had taken to practicing on the loom with plain cotton warp, which was cheap and forgiving, working through the basics of threading and treadling the way he had worked through the basics of joinery at 19, methodically, without asking for shortcuts, understanding each step before moving to the next one. He ruined 4 warps in the first month, cut them off, and started over without apparent distress. By March, he was producing consistent cloth at a width of 8 inches, which was narrow but even. By June, he had moved to 14 inches. By August, he had the loom fully dressed for the width it was designed for, which was 48 inches, which is a wide cloth by any standard, and requires a consistent tension across a lot of warp threads to stay even. He drove to Berea one weekend in September and spent a day with an instructor there, a woman named Donna Swick, who had been teaching at the craft school for 11 years. She looked at his loom setup from photographs before he arrived, and when she came to his smokehouse that Saturday morning and saw the machine in person, she stopped in the doorway for a moment. She said she had not expected the size of it. She said the dressing on the back beam, which is the way the warp tension cords are tied off, was unlike anything she had set up in a teaching context. She asked where he had gotten the method. He showed her the notebooks. She read through the relevant pages while he went inside and made coffee, and when he came back, she was still reading. She told him the loom could produce cloth at a structural integrity that modern frame looms, even the good ones, rarely matched, because the old mountain builders had understood something about tension's distribution across a wide frame that the later factory designs had largely abandoned in the interest of faster setup and faster production. The notebooks described a particular method of weaving the tension cords at the back beam that Donna had never seen documented anywhere outside of academic texts about pre-industrial Appalachian textiles, and had certainly never seen in practice. The method involved a secondary lashing at the breast beam that absorbed variations in weft tension as the weaving progressed, which is a problem that every serious weaver knows and almost no modern loom design accounts for structurally. Court said his grandfather had called it the spring road, because it gave the warp room to breathe without losing tension. Donna said she would very much like a copy of the relevant pages. He sent them to her in December of that year, along with a folded square of the first wool and linen cloth he had woven on the full width of the loom. He had produced that cloth in November, a plain twill in natural wool and unbleached linen, nothing complicated in its construction, 40 yards long at 48 inches wide. When he held it up to the window, it had a quality that he recognized from the notebook's description, but had not expected to experience directly. The way you can know about a thing from reading and still be surprised when you see it. It had a density and an evenness that the production weaving he had observed in the Berea studio did not quite have, because the tension system distributed the load differently across the warp, keeping each thread under consistent tension as the shed opened and closed. It had what the notebooks called stand, meaning that it held its shape under lateral pressure without feeling stiff or board-like, and it had a hand, which is the term weavers use for the tactile quality of fabric. That was different from anything Ray had encountered in her textile program. He sent her a yard of it in January of 2011 with a note that said only, "Tell me what you think." She called him 4 days later. She asked where he had gotten the wool processed. He told her. She asked about the linen. He told her. Then she was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is handling something and trying to find the right words. She said, "Dad, this is not a craft fair product." He said he knew. She asked what he was going to do with it. He said he was working on that. If you are familiar with this kind of story, you already know that what happens next is that the world eventually finds the thing that a patient person has been building. The question is always how long it takes, and at what cost, and who has to be wrong first. The answer in this case involves several years of small demonstrations, a structural disruption in the domestic textile market that nobody predicted, and a buyer from Asheville who had been looking for exactly what she found in that Kentucky smokehouse without knowing it existed. Gerald Hatfield came by the shop again in the spring of 2013 for a furniture transaction. And while he was there, Court showed him what he had been producing. Gerald looked at the cloth. He felt it. He was a fair-minded man, and he said it was well made. And then he said that the market for hand-woven wool and linen had been essentially flat for a decade, and he didn't see what changed that math. He used the word boutique, which was meant as a measured, professional assessment, and landed the way those words usually land. Court nodded and folded the cloth back on the table. Gerald had said it before, in different form, and he would say it again. He said it one more time at a furniture dealers' meeting in Hazard in 2015, where someone brought up Court's weaving as a curiosity, and Gerald said politely that it was a fine craft, but a boutique proposition, hard to scale, and the regional market would cap it. He was not unkind. He was simply working from data that he trusted. What Gerald's data did not include was what was happening between 2012 and 2016 in the American contract textile market. Let me tell you about that because it is the mechanism that made the math work in a way nobody in Harlan County was tracking. The contract textile market is where cloth goes when it is sold not to individual buyers at a craft fair or a retail shop, but to designers, upholsterers, restoration specialists, and studios that produce bespoke goods for commercial and high-end residential clients. It is a world apart from the regional handcraft economy that Gerald Hatfield knew and priced correctly. The buyers in this market are not looking for something decorative or locally made. They are looking for cloth with specific structural properties that they cannot get from standard production sources, and they will pay prices that the craft fair market would consider absurd because they have no alternative. This market had, for most of the 20th century, drawn its highest grade wool and linen blend fabric from European mills, particularly from a cluster of British and Belgian fabric houses that had maintained hand and semi-hand production techniques for specific grades of cloth that fully automated production could not consistently reproduce. These mills were small by industrial standards. Many of them had been in continuous operation since the 19th century, which meant they were running equipment and techniques that the industrial mainstream had long since abandoned, and the cloth they produced had properties that the mainstream could not easily replicate. Dimensional stability, meaning the fabric did not shift or distort when cut and sewn, because the tension distribution during weaving had been uniform throughout. Structural density, meaning it did not compress or thin out under pressure and wear in the manner of lighter production weaves. And what serious buyers called authenticity of hand, which is almost impossible to specify in a materials brief, but immediately recognizable to someone who works with cloth every day, who can feel in 10 seconds the difference between fabric that was woven under consistent mechanical tension and fabric that was woven under the variable tension of a system that the weaver was compensating for throughout. Those European mills had been struggling since the early 2000s. Rising labor costs, reduced government subsidy programs in the post-expansion European Union, the decline of domestic wool production in Britain, and the relentless competition of synthetic fiber imports had closed a significant number of them by 2014. The smaller ones went first, the ones operating on one or two looms with a handful of staff, which were also often the ones producing the most specialized grades. American restoration designers and high-end upholstery studios, which had depended on those mills for specific grades of fabric that domestic production had never been organized to supply, found their supply chains narrowing in ways that no available domestic alternative was positioned to fill. Court Blevins knew none of this. He had not read about it in any trade publication, because he did not subscribe to any trade publication in the textile industry. He had not heard about it at any dealer meeting, because the furniture restoration market he moved in did not discuss European fabric mill closures. He was making cloth in a smokehouse in Harlan County, Kentucky, because the notebooks his grandfather left described a loom that could make a specific kind of cloth, and he had found that loom, and he wanted to find out if the notebooks were right. The notebooks were right. He had, by 2014, produced roughly 400 yards of fabric. Most of it was in storage. He had sold small amounts through a craft cooperative in Berea, at prices that were good by craft fair standards and not relevant to any other scale. He had also, following Ray's persistent advice, built a simple website with photographs of the cloth and the loom, the kind of website that looks like a man's hobby page rather than a business. Ray had insisted on quality photographs. He had let her take them. Ray had come home the summer after her graduate program at the Savannah College of Art and Design, where she had spent 2 years in a textile design program and had in the process met a number of people who worked in the contract fabric market. She had started talking to those people about her father's operation the previous winter. Not selling, just describing. In October of 2015, a woman named Frances Mott drove up from Asheville to look at what he was making. She ran a textile studio that supplied restoration fabric to historic preservation projects and high-end residential designers across the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. A studio with a strong reputation among the kind of architects and interior conservators who worked on 19th century buildings and wanted materials that behaved the way materials of that period had behaved. She had heard about Court from 2 different people in the course of 6 months, which was one more than she usually needed to justify a long drive. She was not, by her own account, optimistic. People in her line of work were contacted regularly by craftspeople, whose work was locally admired but not structurally what she needed. She drove up on a Tuesday morning with a professional wariness that she was practiced at maintaining. She spent most of that day in the smokehouse, not talking much. She handled the cloth for a long time, running her palm across the face and back of several pieces, checking the selvage edges for evenness, holding sections at angles to the window to look at how the weave structure caught the light. She asked Court to show her the loom running, which he did, and she watched the tension system through its full sequence without comment, her eyes moving between the back beam and the shed as it opened. At one point, she crouched down to look at the lashing on the breast beam and stayed there for several minutes. Then she stood up and picked up a yard of the wool and linen blend, held it at an angle to the window light, and turned it over twice. She said, "Where did you learn the tension method?" He showed her the notebooks. She read the relevant pages without speaking. She went back to 2 pages a second time. She was quiet for a while after that, in the way of someone who has just confirmed something they were not quite prepared to find confirmed. Then she said, quietly, that she had been ordering a comparable cloth from a mill in Worcestershire, England, since 2007, and the mill had informed her in August of that year that they were ceasing production of that grade at the end of 2015. She had been looking without success for an alternative source since September. She asked how much he had in stock. He said 260 yards. She asked his price per yard. He said $40. She looked at the cloth in her hands one more time. Then she said she would take all of it and come back for more. That was the first transaction. 260 yards at $40, which came to $10,400 for cloth he had produced in a converted smokehouse from a loom he had bought for $250 at an auction where nobody else wanted it. Francis arranged delivery by March of 2016 and placed a second order in June of that year and a third in November. By 2017, the wait list for an order had grown to 6 months, and Court had taken on a part-time assistant, a woman named Vera from Harlan, who had grown up weaving on a smaller 4-shaft loom at home, and who learned the back beam tension system in about 3 months from the notebooks, with Court standing beside her the first 2 weeks and then largely leaving her alone. By 2018, Ray had moved back from a design job in Nashville and was managing the production schedule and the client correspondence. They were selling at $60 a yard by then, and the wait for a new order had grown to 8 months. Gerald Hatfield heard about the Asheville orders in 2016, not from Court, but from the Furniture Network. He came by the shop in the fall of that year, and Court showed him the production log. Gerald looked at the numbers for a while. He was a fair-minded man, as established, and he said, "I'll be honest with you. I didn't see this. Court said there was no particular reason he would have." Gerald sat down on the edge of a work table and looked at the loom running for a few minutes. Then he asked if there was anything he could do. Court said he could pass the word to any furniture dealers he knew who worked in historic restoration, because that market would understand the cloth. Gerald did exactly that, and 3 of his contacts became clients by the following spring. That was Gerald's recalibration. It was quiet, and it was complete. He did not pretend he had never said boutique. He did not pretend the math had ever worked out the way he thought. He looked at a ledger he had not expected to see, and he updated his position, and that is all that the moment required. Now let me tell you about Lois Strand and the $34,000, because that number needs to be understood against everything that had already happened. Lois Strand came to the property in September of 2023. She was a textile appraiser contracted by Francis Mott's studio, which had grown by that point into a supplier for museum conservation projects and historic house restorations across the eastern United States, and one of the few North American sources for high-grade period-appropriate wool and linen blend fabric. The studio had also, in 2021, begun supplying a clothing manufacturer in Vermont that was producing reproduction 19th century work garments for museum gift shops, which required cloth that behaved under wear and washing in ways that modern fabric did not. Francis was in the early stages of considering whether to help fund an expansion of Court's operation, specifically the construction of a second outbuilding that could house a second loom if one could be found and restored. Before she committed to that conversation, she wanted to know what the foundational asset was worth on its own terms. Lois spent 2 hours with the loom, working methodically through an appraisal protocol she had developed over 20 years of assessing historic textile equipment. She photographed the joinery at the back beam, the breast beam lashing, and all 4 corners of the frame where the uprights joined the lower rails. She ran the treadles through their full sequence. She tested the beater for square against a reference frame she carried. She pulled out a small moisture meter and took readings at 6 points on the frame. She handled the reed, which Court had shown her the repaired teeth in, and noted in her assessment that the brass teeth were a period appropriate repair executed with unusual precision. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, across from Court and Ray, and said that what they had was, as best she could determine, a complete working Appalachian mountain floor loom, built somewhere between 1855 and 1875 from high-elevation red maple, with the original pinned mortise and tenon joinery intact at every joint, and a tension system she had encountered in academic literature but had never seen in functioning operation. She paused. She said the condition was exceptional. She said she had appraised 17 historic looms in the past decade, and of those 17, 4 had been structurally complete, and none had been in working order. She said that, in the American textile arts market, a loom of that age in that condition had an assessed value she was putting at $17,000. Court looked at her across the kitchen table. Ray was watching her father. Lois said she wanted to be clear that $17,000 was the asset value, meaning what a museum or collector or institutional buyer would pay for the object itself, and not the replacement cost, because there was no replacement. There was no mill, no craftsman, no established supply chain that could produce a functionally equivalent loom. What he had was, in the strict sense, irreplaceable. He said he would keep it. He did not say this with any weight or drama. He said it the way a man says something he settled a long time ago and sees no reason to reopen. He said it, and then he asked Lois if she wanted coffee. She went back to Asheville and reported to Francis. Francis, who understood better than anyone what the loom was producing and how little anything comparable existed in domestic supply, authorized the second offer without another site visit. She had the numbers she needed from 14 years of production data. $34,000 for the loom. Court turned that down too. He was not holding out for more money. He was not running a negotiation. He simply understood, in the concrete and practical way that he understood most things, that the loom was not a separable asset. Without the loom, you had the notebooks and 2 people who knew the tension system, which was interesting but incomplete. Without the notebooks and the people, the loom was an exceptional antique in working condition, worth a price a museum might pay. Without the loom, the notebooks and the tension system were a description of a method with no machine to run it on. The whole thing was the thing. The loom and the system and the notebooks and the people who knew them and the smokehouse with its controlled humidity were one thing, and you could not price one piece of one thing without dismantling the rest. What happened instead was different and better than a sale. Frances structured an arrangement in which her studio became the primary purchaser of Court's production at a contracted price of $85 per yard, guaranteed for 5 years, with an option to extend. She also funded the restoration of the smokehouse workshop, which by that point needed a new roof and better humidity control for the stored warp. In exchange, she received first purchase rights and a clause that required Court to document the tension system and the warping method in a format that the studio could archive. Ray handled the documentation. She spent the better part of a winter writing up the notebook's specifications in clear, modern, technical language, cross-referenced with photographs and measurements. The document ran to 60 pages. It was, in a practical sense, the first formal written account of that particular loom building and weaving tradition, since Court's grandfather had put it down in water-stained pages in a tin box. 3 of the studios that had come into the client list through Gerald's furniture network sent staff to observe the warping process in person that spring. 2 of them sent apprentice weavers the following summer. Neither of them had a loom like Court's, but both had older looms with similar joinery that they had not known how to fully use, and the documentation helped them understand their own equipment in ways they had not expected. That is the spread. That is almost always how it works, once a thing is recognized for what it is. Court is still in the smokehouse. He turned 67 in March. Ray runs the business side. His assistant, who has become a capable weaver in her own right, handles the primary warping now, and a second assistant has been in training for a year. The loom runs 4 days a week, which is what the timber and the tension system can sustain without excess wear, and the production log shows roughly 320 yards per year at the current pace. The tin box is on the same shelf where Roy put it. Ray added a waterproof liner to it 2 years ago. Dale Fitch, who is retired now, heard the story through the Harlan County grapevine sometime around 2018. He is said to have taken it well, which is the most you can ask of anyone in that position. He told someone he wished he'd looked harder at the wood. That is the right lesson, though it is not quite the whole lesson. Here is what the rest of it says if you step back from the numbers. There are 2 ways of knowing what a thing is worth. One of them works from comparable sales and market rates and the data that a system agrees to measure. It is not wrong. It is, in fact, very good at telling you what a thing has been worth to people who already knew what it was. The problem is that it has nothing to say about a thing that the system has not yet seen, or a value that the system has not yet agreed to measure. A loom built from slow-grown mountain maple with a tension system no longer in common practice is, by comparable sales logic, worth whatever the last one sold for at auction, which is to say somewhere near nothing. The logic is circular. The measurement creates the category, and the category confirms the measurement. The other way of knowing works from attention. It requires that you stand in front of a thing long enough to understand what it is, not what it looks like, not what comparable things have sold for, but what the thing itself is and does and can do in the right hands with the right information. That knowledge is slow, and it is specific, and it does not produce a spreadsheet. It produces, eventually, a loom that has been running for 14 years and a set of notebooks that a studio in Asheville paid to have formally documented, and a contract at $85 per yard, and a room full of cloth that has properties you cannot get from any current source. $250 at an October auction. $34,000, sight unseen, 14 years later. The difference is not inflation. The difference is attention, applied to one particular object, over enough time to understand what it was. What a market can measure, and what a thing is worth, are not the same number. What endures is what was worth understanding in the first place.